If you're new here, we take the Bible apart, layer by layer, historically, literally, and spiritually, one passage at a time. Tonight, we are beginning something new. We are starting at the very beginning, the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, the foundation of everything that follows, and one of the most misread and misunderstood texts in human history. We are not here to debate science or to score theological points. We are here to ask what these words actually meant, who wrote them, and why they still matter. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Historical context. To understand the weight of these opening lines, we must look at the world into which they were first spoken, around 1440 BC. The original audience consisted of Israelites wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus. They were a people whose cultural memory was saturated with the gods of Egypt. Deities like Ra, the sun god, or Osiris, the god of the afterlife. As they moved toward the land of Canaan, they were entering a territory dominated by the worship of Baal and El. In all of these surrounding cultures, creation was almost always the result of violence, sexual procreation, or a desperate struggle between rival gods. One of the most significant historical parallels is the Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish. In that story, the world is formed after a brutal war between the younger gods and the primordial mother of chaos, Tiamat, who personifies the saltwater ocean. The hero god Marduk kills Tiamat and splits her body in two, using one half to create the sky and the other half to create the earth. In this Mesopotamian worldview, the universe is essentially recycled from the remains of a defeated, angry monster, and creation is an accident of conflict, and the materials of the world are divine but chaotic. Against this backdrop, Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 makes a startling and exclusive counterclaim. It introduces Elohim, the God of Israel, who acts alone and without effort. There is no war, no divine marriage, and no struggle against a chaos monster. By stating that God created the heavens and the earth, Moses is declaring that the physical world is not made of the corpses of dead gods. It is the deliberate, ordered construction of a single, sovereign will. To the Israelites, this was a revolutionary act of demythologization. It stripped the sun, the moon, us and the deep waters of their divinity, and placed them firmly in the category of created things. The condition of the earth in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, described as formless and empty, also resonates with ancient Near Eastern thought. In the Egyptian Heliopolitan myth, the world begins with the emergence of a primordial mound out of the infinite, dark, watery chaos called Nun. In the ancient world, nothingness was not the absence of matter, but the absence of function and order. A desert was nothing because nothing lived there. A sea was nothing because it was untamed. By describing the earth as formless and empty, or tohu wabohu in Hebrew, the text is acknowledging the state of the world before God's organizing word had been spoken. However, the critical historical difference here is the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. In many other ancient myths, the deep is a terrifying, malevolent force that must be conquered. In Genesis, the deep is merely the canvas. The Spirit of God is already there, not as a combatant, but as a watchful, active presence. For an audience of refugees who had just seen the waters of the Red Sea parted by this same God, These verses were a reminder that the chaos of the world was never a threat to the one who made it. Literal breakdown. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 begins with the Hebrew word Bereshit. While we translate this as in the beginning, it serves as more than a simple chronological marker. In the structure of the Hebrew Bible, this word provides the title for the entire book, establishing that the narrative of God's people is rooted in the narrative of all existence. The word for God used here is Elohim. This is a plural noun, which in Hebrew grammar is often used as a plural of majesty to denote the fullness, power, and multifaceted nature of the Creator. It is significant that this specific name is used rather than the personal covenant name Yahweh, because Genesis chapter 1 is establishing God as the universal architect of all nations, not just Israel. The verb for created is bara. This is a highly specialized word in the Hebrew scriptures because it is used exclusively with God as the subject. Humans can make or form things out of existing materials, but only God can bara. This suggests the concept of creatio ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. When the text says he created the heavens and the earth, it is using a literary device called a merism. By naming the two furthest extremes of reality, the heights of the sky and the depths of the ground, it is a way of saying he created the entire universe and everything in between. Moving to Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, we encounter the famous phrase tohu wabohu. In the New International Version, this is translated as formless and empty. The words carry a rhythmic, rhyming quality in the original language that suggests a state of wild, uninhabitable waste. It is a world that is not yet functional for life. The deep, mentioned here, is the Hebrew word tehom. While this is linguistically related to the Babylonian chaos monster Tiamat, the author of Genesis intentionally strips the word of all personification. In this text, the deep is not a god or a monster. It is simply a vast body of water waiting for its creator's command. The Spirit of God is the Ruach Elohim. The word Ruach can mean spirit, wind, or breath. This implies that God's very essence is present and active at the boundary of the unformed world. The word for hovering is mereshephet. This is a rare and beautiful verb that appears again in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 11, to describe an eagle fluttering over its young in the nest. It conveys a sense of intense, protective, and expectant energy. The Spirit is not just present, he is poised to act, like a mother bird waiting for life to emerge from the shell. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual heartbeat of these opening verses is the radical independence and sovereignty of God. Before anything else existed, before there was a heavens or an earth, there was God. This means that the universe is not an extension of God's own substance, nor is it a necessary part of his being. Instead, it is the result of a free, loving, and sovereign choice. For the reader, this provides an immediate sense of purpose. If the world is a deliberate creation, rather than an accidental explosion or a cosmic battle, then every part of that world has an intended place and a reason for being. The condition of the earth in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 offers a profound insight into how God works with the chaos of existence. The darkness and the formless void are not presented as evil things to be destroyed, but as the raw material for a greater order. This suggests that in the spiritual life, periods of emptiness or formlessness, times when life feels disorganized, unproductive, or dark, are not signs of God's absence. On the contrary, These are the very environments where the Spirit of God hovers. The darkness over the surface of the deep is the prelude to the first word of light. It teaches that God is comfortable in the dark, and that he is often most active when things appear to be at their most stagnant. Furthermore, the description of the Spirit hovering over the waters introduces the theme of divine anticipation. God does not rush the process of creation. He allows his Spirit to brood over the waters, preparing the way for the speech that will bring structure and life. This speaks to the value of patience and the hidden work that precedes any visible manifestation of God's power. It encourages the believer to trust the hovering moments of their own lives, recognizing that the Spirit is often doing his most vital work just before the light breaks through. Finally, the fact that God is the sole actor in these verses establishes a foundation of absolute security. In a world of competing voices and shifting powers, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 anchors the soul in the reality that there is one final authority. If God is the one who defined the beginning, then he is also the one who holds the end. The formless and empty world is not a threat to his sovereignty. It is his workshop. This vision invites the reader to move away from a fear-based view of the world and into a posture of trust by knowing that the one who organized the cosmos from the depths of the Tehom is more than capable of bringing order to the complexities of human history. Following the dark, expectant stillness of the first two verses, the narrative now shifts from the hovering of the Spirit to the active command of the Creator. This is the moment where the silence of the void is broken, not by a cosmic explosion, but by a voice. In the next 3 verses, we see the introduction of the first created element, light, and the establishment of the most fundamental rhythm of human existence, time. Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Historical context. For the Israelites, who had just spent 400 years in Egypt, the concept of light was inseparable from the sun god, Ra. In Egyptian theology, Ra was the supreme deity, the source of life and order, who sailed across the sky in a solar bark. To the Egyptians, and indeed to almost every culture in the ancient Near East, the sun was not a physical object, it was a god. By placing the creation of light in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3, 3 full days before the sun, moon and stars even appear, Moses is making a massive, sophisticated polemical strike. He is telling the Israelites that light does not depend on Ra. Light is a creation of the God of Israel, and the sun is merely a vessel that would be created later to carry it. This was a radical act of demythologization that stripped the celestial bodies of their divine status. Furthermore, the method of creation, God speaking, stood in sharp contrast to the myths of Mesopotamia. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the world is created through the violent dismemberment of a goddess. In other myths, the world is born through sexual procreation between deities. In Genesis, however, there is no violence and no biology. There is only speech. While some Egyptian traditions, like the Memphite theology of the god Ptah, suggested that a god could create through thought and word, Genesis clarifies that this word belongs to Elohim alone. To a first-century audience, this established God as a being of supreme intelligence and effortless authority. Now, he does not need to struggle with matter. He simply commands it. The act of separating light from darkness in Genesis chapter 1 verse 4 is another crucial historical marker. In the ancient world, chaos was often represented by the inability to distinguish between things. A formless world was one where everything was mixed together in a dark, watery soup. By separating the light from the darkness, God is performing the primary function of an ancient Near Eastern king. He is bringing order and boundaries to his realm. He is not destroying the darkness, but he is assigning it a place. This would have been deeply comforting to a people living in the wilderness, a place that often felt chaotic and boundaryless. It signaled that their God was the master of order. Finally, the naming of day and night in Genesis chapter 1 verse 5 was a significant exercise of ancient authority. In the ancient Near East, to name something was to claim ownership and sovereignty over it. By naming the day and the night, God is claiming authority over time itself. He is setting the clock of the universe. In many pagan myths, time was a cyclical, often cruel force, governed by different warring deities. Genesis asserts that time is a linear construct created and named by the single God of Israel. For a people whose time had been owned by Pharaoh for centuries, the realization that their God owned time itself was a declaration of ultimate freedom. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, we encounter the first recorded words of God. Let there be light. The Hebrew phrase is Yehi or Ami, followed immediately by Wayehi, or, which means, and there was light. There is a rhythmic, snapping quality to the Hebrew grammar here. The verb is in the jussive mood, which is the mood of a command or a desire. This is not a request or a hope. It is the exercise of a will that possesses the immediate power to manifest its own decree. It is important to notice that in the literal text, there is no interval between the command and the result. The word and the reality are essentially the same thing. The light created in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 is the Hebrew word or. It is distinct from the lights created later on the fourth day, which are more, meaning light bearers, or luminaries. Literally, this primordial light is a quality or an energy rather than a specific physical object like the sun. In the literal sequence of the chapter, light exists before the objects that we typically associate with light. This suggests that in the biblical worldview, light is a fundamental building block of the universe, a necessary precursor to the existence of anything else. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 4, we see the first divine evaluation. God saw that the light was good. The Hebrew word for good is tob. In this ancient context, tob does not just mean morally upright or aesthetically pleasing. It means that something is fit for its purpose. It means the light works. It is functional and harmonious within the design God is building. Following this evaluation, God separated the light from the darkness. The verb for separated is bardal. This is a technical term used throughout the Hebrew scriptures for making a distinction or a division. And it is the same word used later for the vault, separating the waters, and the curtain in the tabernacle, separating the holy place from the most holy place. Literally, God is carving out boundaries where there were none. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, God called the light day and the darkness night. The verb kara, to call or to name, is an act of lordship. In the ancient world, the person who named a thing was the person who defined its nature and held authority over it. By naming these periods of time, God is claiming sovereignty over the temporal order. Finally, we reach the phrase, "And there was evening, and there was morning," the first day. In the original Hebrew, this is actually Yom Echad, which translates literally as day one or one day, rather than the first day. This is linguistically significant because it defines what a day is for the first time. It establishes a rhythm of Ereb, evening, and Boker, morning. The literal order is important. The day begins with evening and moves toward morning. This defines the Jewish understanding of time that persists to this day, where the new day begins at sundown. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual significance of light being the first creation in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 cannot be overstated. It reveals that the very first condition for God's work is the removal of obscurity. Light represents clarity, truth, and the presence of God. Before God addresses the formlessness of the land or the emptiness of the seas, he addresses the darkness. This suggests a spiritual principle. Before a life can be ordered or filled, it must first be illuminated. Divine light is the prerequisite for all other forms of growth and structure. It teaches us that the first step of any creative or restorative work is simply to see things as they truly are. The fact that God creates through speech in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 introduces the theme of the creative word. It implies that the universe is fundamentally linguistic and rational. If the world was spoken into existence, then it can be understood, interpreted, and responded to. Spiritually, this means that the primary way humans interact with God is through hearing and listening. It elevates the status of the Word from mere information to a life-giving force. It reminds the reader that God does not work through physical coercion or frantic labor, but through the calm, authoritative expression of his mind. There is a deep peace in knowing that the foundation of the world is a word that remains consistent and true. The separation of light from darkness in Genesis chapter 1 verse 4 is a powerful lesson in the beauty of boundaries. In our modern culture, we often view limitation as a negative thing, but in the Genesis account, separation is an act of goodness. Darkness is not eliminated. It is given a boundary. This suggests that the spiritual life is not about the total destruction of every difficult or dark element, but about the proper management and placement of those elements. Order comes when we distinguish between the day and the night in our own lives. It is the wisdom to know when to act and when to rest, when to speak and when to be silent. The goodness of creation is found in its distinctions. Finally, the rhythm of evening and morning in Genesis chapter 1 verse 5 offers a profound perspective on hope. In many secular views of history, things move from the morning of youth and progress toward the evening of decay and death. But the biblical rhythm is the exact opposite. The day begins in the evening and moves toward the dawn. This is a foundational spiritual metaphor for the human experience. It suggests that even when we find ourselves in the evening, a season of darkness, uncertainty, or ending, we are actually at the beginning of God's cycle, not the end. The movement of the Spirit is always toward the morning. It reframes the concept of time from a march toward the grave into a journey toward the light. Every night is merely the precursor to a new day defined and named by God. The work of the second day moves us from the creation of light to the creation of space. While the first day addressed the problem of darkness, the second day addresses the problem of the deep, described in the opening verses. This passage introduces a concept of the universe. that is significantly different from our modern scientific understanding, but which carried immense theological and political weight for the people of the ancient Near East. Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters, to separate water from water." So God made the vault, and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault Sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Historical context. To grasp the impact of Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, we must reconstruct the mental map of the world as it was understood by the Israelites and their neighbors in the second millennium before Christ. In the ancient Near East, the universe was not viewed as an infinite vacuum of space. Instead, it was seen as a three-tiered structure consisting of the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the underworld, or the deep below. The primary threat to existence in this worldview was water. To the ancients, the blue of the sky and the blue of the sea were evidence that the world was entirely surrounded by a vast primordial ocean. Without a protective barrier, these cosmic waters would collapse and drown the dry land, returning everything to the formless chaos of the beginning. In the Mesopotamian myths that surrounded the Israelites, the creation of this barrier was a story of extreme violence. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the hero god Marduk engages in a terrifying battle with Tiamat, the personification of the saltwater ocean. After killing her, Marduk slices her enormous corpse in half like a dried fish. He uses one half of her body to create the roof of the sky, stretching it out to hold back the upper waters. He then places guards and bars at this ceiling so that her waters cannot escape without his permission. In this historical context, the sky was literally made of the remains of a defeated, angry goddess. The safety of the world depended on the strength of a warrior god who was constantly keeping a monster's remains in check. The Egyptian worldview, which the Israelites had lived in for 4 centuries, offered a different but equally mythological perspective. The Egyptians believed the sky was the body of the goddess Nut, who arched over the earth god Geb. She was held up by the air god Shu to keep the waters of the celestial ocean from overwhelming the land of Egypt. In both the Babylonian and Egyptian systems, the vault of the sky was either a deity or part of a deity. The natural world was saturated with competing personalities, and humans lived in the middle of a divine family drama where the sky could be capricious or temperamental. Against these powerful cultural narratives, Genesis chapter 1 verse 6 makes a revolutionary claim. Moses presents the vault as a purely functional, inanimate object created by the command of a single God. There is no battle with a sea monster and no stretching out of a goddess's body. God speaks and a vault appears. By using the term rakia, which we will explore in the literal section, the text presents the sky as a piece of architectural engineering. To a people who had spent generations building the monuments of Egypt under the whip of Pharaoh, the idea of God as a master builder who simply speaks a structure into existence was a profound elevation of his power. This passage also serves to demythologize the weather. In other ancient cultures, rain was seen as a divine substance, or the result of a god opening a window in the sky goddess. By stating in Genesis chapter 1 verse 7 that God separated the waters, the text is establishing a logical, ordered system. It tells the Israelites that the sky is a protective canopy designed by their God to create a bubble of safety where life can flourish. It transformed the terrifying, chaotic, deep into a managed resource. For a people moving through a desert wilderness where water was a matter of life and death, the realization that their God was the one who managed the waters above and the waters below was a declaration of absolute security. The sky was no longer a goddess to be feared or appeased. It was a testament to the order and mercy of their Creator. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 6, the New International Version uses the word vault. The Hebrew word is rokia. To the original audience, this was a much more tactile and industrial term than our modern concept of empty space or atmosphere. The root verb is raka, which means to hammer out or to beat out a thin plate of metal, much like a craftsman fashioning a gold bowl or a bronze shield. Literally, God is acting as a divine architect or blacksmith, hammering out a resilient, expansive dome to create a protected volume within the chaos. The purpose of this vault is to separate water from water. The Hebrew preposition used here is bin, which implies a distinct division or a clear interval. Before this moment, the universe was a singular, undifferentiated mass of watery chaos. Now, God introduces a gap. This is the first creation of space. Without this structural gap, there would be no atmospheric room for birds to fly, no space for weather to form, and no environment for humans to eventually breathe. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 7, we see the transition from command to execution. So God made the vault. The verb for made here is asa, which is distinct from the bara used in the very first verse. While bara emphasizes the initiation of something entirely new, asa often refers to the fashioning, shaping, or appointment of something to a specific function. God is taking the primordial elements and shaping them into a functional barrier. Interestingly, in the Hebrew text for the second day, the standard phrase, "and God saw that it was good," is noticeably absent. Many commentators suggest this is because the work of managing the waters was not yet finished until the third day, when the dry land finally appears. However, the verse concludes with the authoritative stamp, "and it was so." This Hebrew phrase, "Wayehi ken," indicates that the physical reality now matched the divine decree with absolute precision. Finally, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 8, God called the vault sky, or Shemaim. In Hebrew, this word is linguistically related to the word for waters, mayim, perhaps suggesting the place where the waters are held. By naming the sky, God once again asserts his ownership and his right to define the nature of the cosmos. The day concludes with the rhythmic marker. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. This confirms that the creation of space and the structural management of the deep was a measured, essential step in the preparation of the earth for life. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual significance of the second day of creation is found in the importance of space. Before God brings growth, life, or fruitfulness, he first creates an atmosphere where those things can exist. In our own spiritual journeys, God often spends time creating room before he brings the actual blessing. This work often feels like a separation, a pulling apart of things that were once mixed together. But the goal of that separation is always to create a place where we can finally breathe and see clearly. It suggests that the first step toward a new season is often the removal of clutter and the establishment of an inner atmosphere of peace and order. There is also a profound message of protection in the image of the hammered-out vault. The world is surrounded by waters that could easily overwhelm it. Yet God has established a firm, resilient barrier that holds them back. This speaks to the providential care of God. It reminds the believer that we live in a bubble of grace. Even when the chaotic forces of life, symbolized by the deep, seem massive and threatening, there is a divine structure in place that they are not permitted to cross. The sky above is a constant visual reminder that God has set limits on chaos. He is the one who hammers out the circumstances of our lives to ensure that we have a protected environment in which to flourish. Furthermore, the act of separating water from water highlights the necessity of distinction in the spiritual life. Chaos is defined by blurred lines, while creation is defined by the clarity of boundaries. We find order and sanity when we allow God to define the boundaries of our time, our energy, and our focus. When we live in the mixed-up state of the primordial deep, we are easily overwhelmed. But when we accept the vault that God provides, we find a sense of stability. It is the wisdom to distinguish between the celestial and the terrestrial, knowing what belongs to the heavens and what belongs to the earth. Finally, the absence of the phrase, "it was good," on the second day, serves as a reminder that we often live in unfinished seasons. The second day was a day of transition, a day of moving from total chaos toward the appearance of dry land. If you feel as though you are in an in-between space, where things have been separated, but the new life hasn't yet appeared, the second day of Genesis offers comfort. It affirms that it was so, even if it does not yet feel good. The structural work of God is the essential foundation for the beauty that is coming on the third day. It is the assurance that the master builder is still on the site, and the space he is clearing now is exactly what you will need for what he is about to do next. We now reach the third day of the creation narrative, a day that is unique because it contains two distinct acts of creation. Having addressed the light on day one and the space in the sky on day two, God now turns his attention to the waters below. This passage marks the transition from a world that is merely a structural shell to a world that is prepared to sustain life. It is the moment where the geography of the earth is defined and the first heartbeat of biological life begins to pulse through the soil. Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 through 13. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Historical context. The third day of creation addresses two of the most vital concerns of the ancient world: the control of the sea and the fertility of the land. To the Israelites, who had just escaped Egypt and were standing on the edge of the promised land, these were not abstract theological points. They were matters of survival. In the ancient Near East, the sea was viewed as the ultimate enemy of order. In the Canaanite myths that the Israelites would encounter in their new home, the god Baal had to fight a terrifying war against Yam, the god of the sea, to prevent the world from being flooded. In the Babylonian stories, as we have seen, the sea was the body of a dead monster. The historical consensus of the time was that the dry land was a fragile accident, constantly threatened by the chaotic power of the ocean. Against this cultural backdrop, Genesis chapter 1 verse 9 makes a profound political and theological statement. God does not fight the water. He commands it. He tells the water to be gathered to one place so that the dry ground can appear. To an Israelite audience, this would immediately remind them of the Exodus. They had just seen the Red Sea gather to the side to let the dry ground appear so they could walk across. Moses is showing them that the power they saw at the Red Sea was not a new trick. It was the original power of the Creator. By seas and land being named by God, the text is asserting that the geography of the earth is not controlled by local water deities or earth gods, but by the single God who gave the law at Sinai. The second half of the third day, the creation of vegetation in Genesis chapter 1 verse 11, strikes at the heart of Egyptian and Canaanite religion. Egypt was a civilization entirely dependent on the Nile. They worshipped the river and the gods of the grain because their lives depended on the soil's ability to produce. In Canaan, the worship of Baal was centered almost entirely on fertility, the belief that people had to perform specific rituals to persuade the gods to send rain and make the crops grow. In religion in the ancient world was often a desperate attempt to bribe the earth into being productive. Genesis deconstructs this entire system by stating that the land produces vegetation because God commanded it to do so at the very beginning. The seed is already in the plant, according to its kind. This phrase, which appears repeatedly, was a revolutionary concept. It meant that the world was designed with a logical, self-sustaining order. Farmers did not need to appease a god of the barley or a god of the vine to get a harvest. The system was established by Elohim and built into the very nature of the soil and the seed. By describing the land as producing seed-bearing plants and fruit trees, Moses is presenting a world that is not capricious or magical, but reliable and generous. It was a message of immense freedom. The Israelites did not need to live in fear of the land's fertility, because the land was simply obeying its creator. Finally, the historical context of the fruit tree is significant. In the ancient Near East, a king's glory was often measured by the gardens and orchards he planted. A great king provided plenty for his people. By showing God covering the earth with every kind of fruit-bearing tree before humans were even created, the text presents God as the ultimate benevolent king. He is not a tyrant demanding food from his subjects. He is the king who prepares a lush, overflowing banquet for his people before they even arrive on the scene. The third day transformed the earth from a terrifying, chaotic, deep into a safe, fruitful home. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 9, we see the command that brings about the geography of our world. God says, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place." The Hebrew word for gathered is kava. This is a fascinating word because its root meaning is to wait for or to look for with expectation. It suggests that the waters were not simply pushed away by force, but were collected into a specific, designated boundary. The result was that dry ground appeared. The Hebrew word for dry ground is yabashah, which literally refers to a place that has been parched or drained of moisture. In the context of the ancient world, this was a massive structural change. The world was no longer a singular, undifferentiated mass of water. It was now a world of continents and oceans. Moving into Genesis chapter 1, verse 10, God performs the act of naming once again. He calls the dry ground land, which is Eretz in Hebrew, and the gathered waters he calls seas, or Yamim. As we have seen in previous verses, this naming is an act of sovereign definition. By naming the land and the seas, God is claiming authority over the very foundations of the earth. For the first time since the creation of light, the text records that God saw that it was good. The Hebrew word for good is tob. This signifies that the preparation of the earth's physical environment, the light, the space, and the solid ground, was now complete and functional for what was to come next. The second act of the third day begins in Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, with a command to the land itself. God says, "Let the land produce vegetation." The word for vegetation is deshi, which refers to the first sprouts of green grass or young plants. This was followed by seed-bearing plants and fruit trees. The phrase, according to their various kinds, is used here for the first time. The Hebrew word for kind is min. This is a crucial literal detail because it establishes the principle of biological fixity. It means that the world was created with an inherent order, where a barley seed would always produce barley, and an apple tree would always produce apples. Life was not chaotic or random. It was structured and predictable. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 12, we see the earth responding to the divine command. The text notes that the land produced plants and trees with seed in it. This indicates that God was not just creating individual plants, but a self-perpetuating system of life. The ability to reproduce was built into the very design of the vegetation. Once again, the evaluation is given. God saw that it was good. The third day is the only day in the creation account where this evaluation is given twice, once for the dry land and once for the vegetation. It signals that a major milestone had been reached. The planet was no longer a wasteland. It was a garden. The day concludes in Genesis chapter 1, verse 13, with the standard marker of evening and morning, closing the accounts of the third day. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual significance of the third day is rooted in the concept of emergence. Just as the dry land emerged from the suffocating waters of the deep, the third day serves as a powerful metaphor for resurrection and new life. In biblical symbolism, water often represents death, chaos, or judgment. When God commands the waters to gather so the land can appear, he is effectively bringing life out of the grave of the sea. For the believer, this teaches that God is the specialist in bringing up what has been submerged. It suggests that no matter how deep the waters of a situation may be, God has the authority to command them to move, revealing the solid ground he has prepared beneath the surface. The dual blessing of the third day, the fact that it is called good twice, highlights the generosity of God's provision. The first, good, refers to the environment, and the second, good, refers to the life that fills it. This reveals a spiritual principle. God does not just provide a place to stand. He provides the nourishment to thrive. He creates the land of our circumstances and then immediately causes that land to be fruitful. This reassures the reader that God is concerned with both our stability and our growth. He is not a God of bare minimums. He is a God of overflowing orchards and seed-bearing abundance. The phrase, according to their kinds, carries a deep spiritual message about the reliability of God's character. by building a world where seeds produce after their own kind, God established a universe based on faithfulness and consistency. Spiritually, this invites us to trust in the laws of the harvest. It teaches that the seeds we sow in our character, our relationships, and our faith will produce a harvest consistent with their nature. It removes the element of luck or magic from the spiritual life and replaces it with the steady, reliable promise of a creator who values order. We can trust the world because we can trust the mind that designed its laws. Finally, the creation of vegetation before the creation of the sun on the fourth day serves as a reminder of the primary source of life. While the plants would eventually need the sun to survive, they were brought into existence solely by the word of God. This teaches a profound spiritual lesson. Our life and our fruitfulness are ultimately dependent on God's command, not on the secondary tools he uses to sustain us. It calls the believer to look past the sun of human resources or natural circumstances and recognize that the power to grow and bear fruit comes directly from the voice of the Creator. On the third day, the evening of a formless world finally moved into the morning of a fertile home, all proving that when God speaks, even the dry ground responds with life. On the fourth day of the creation narrative, the focus shifts back to the celestial realms. Having established the space of the sky on the second day and the fertility of the land on the third, God now populates the heavens with the luminaries. This passage is perhaps the most aggressive and brilliant piece of polemical writing in the entire ancient world. It is not merely a description of how the stars came to be. It is a systematic dismantling of the most powerful religions of the ancient Near East. Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times, and days, and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. Historical context. To appreciate the radical nature of Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19, we must understand that in the ancient world, the sun, the moon, and the stars were not viewed as physical objects. They were viewed as the most powerful and terrifying gods in existence. In Egypt, the sun was Ra, the supreme creator and king of the gods. In Mesopotamia, the sun was Shamash, the god of justice, and the moon was Sin, the god of wisdom and time. The stars were often associated with the heavenly host of lesser deities, or the god Ishtar. Astrology, the belief that these celestial gods determined the fate of kings and nations, was the dominant scientific and religious system of the day. People lived in constant fear of the movements of the stars and the moods of the sun and moon. Genesis enters this world and performs a breathtaking act of demotion. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 16, Moses does something shocking. He refuses to even name the sun and the moon. In Hebrew, the words for sun and moon are Shemesh and Yariach. These names were almost identical to the names of the sun and moon deities in neighboring cultures. Then by calling them simply the greater light and the lesser light, the author is stripping them of their personal names and their divine identities. He is reducing the kings of the gods to functional, inanimate objects. They are not deities to be worshipped. They are lights or lamps hung in the vault of the sky by the hand of the one true God. The historical purpose of these lights is also redefined. In pagan myths, the sun and moon governed human life according to their own capricious wills. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, God declares that they are created to serve. They are divine servants or tools designed to mark sacred times and days and years. The Hebrew word for sacred times refers to the festivals and religious calendars of Israel. This was a profound historical claim. The sun and moon do not dictate God's schedule. They are the clocks that God created so that his people could keep his schedule. The celestial bodies were removed from the throne and placed in the tool belt of the Creator. Furthermore, the phrase, "He also made the stars," in Genesis chapter 1, verse 16, is one of the most significant understatements in literature. In the ancient Near East, the stars were the focus of immense religious devotion and complex divination rituals. Kingdoms rose and fell based on the alignment of the planets. Yet, in the Genesis account, the creation of the entire billion-star universe is handled in a four-word afterthought. Moses is telling the Israelites that the stars that the Babylonians and Egyptians feared so much are so insignificant to the God of Israel that their creation is barely worth a separate sentence. They are not masters of fate. They are merely decorations in God's house. For a people who had been immersed in the astral worship of Egypt, this was a declaration of total liberation. It meant that the gods of their oppressors were just physical lights following a programmed path. It meant that their fate was not written in the stars, but was held in the hand of the one who set them in the sky. By making the sun and moon governors of the day and night under his authority, God was establishing a universe of order, predictability, and safety. The fourth day of creation turned the terrifying gods of the heavens into helpful clocks for the inhabitants of the earth. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, the command introduces the lights in the vault of the sky. The Hebrew word here is meor, which is different from the word or used on the first day. While or refers to the fundamental energy of light itself, meor literally means a light bearer or a lamp. It describes a physical vessel or container for light. The purpose of these lamps is fourfold: to separate day from night, to serve as signs, to mark sacred times, and to define days and years. The word for sacred times is mod, a term that occurs throughout the Hebrew Bible to describe the appointed festivals and holy convocations of Israel. Literally, God is installing a celestial clock designed to help humans synchronize their lives with his liturgical calendar. Moving to Genesis chapter 1, verse 16, we see the act of making. The text says, God made two great lights. The Hebrew uses the terms Hama or Hagadol, meaning the greater luminary, and Hama or Hakaton, meaning the smaller luminary. By refusing to use the specific Hebrew names for the sun and moon, the text maintains a strict focus on their function as lamps, rather than their identity as personalities. They are described as having the job to govern or to rule, which is the Hebrew verb mashal. All this is a delegated authority. They rule the day and night only because they have been set there by God. The phrase, "He also made the stars," at the end of Genesis chapter 1, verse 16, consists of only 3 words in the original Hebrew. Ve'et hakokabim. The literal brevity of this phrase is a grammatical tool used to emphasize the ease of the creation. The stars, which the ancient world viewed as the controllers of destiny, are treated as a minor addition to the project. Finally, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 17, and Genesis chapter 1, verse 18, as God set these lights in the vault, the Hebrew verb is natan, which literally means to give or to place. It implies that the celestial bodies are a gift from God to the earth, specifically designed to provide light, order, and distinction. The evaluation "it was good" confirms that the celestial infrastructure for time and navigation is perfectly suited for its intended use. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual center of the fourth day is the invitation to live a life free from fatalism. By demoting the sun, moon, and stars from gods to lamps, Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19, removes the spiritual power of astrology and superstition. It teaches that our lives are not governed by the alignment of the planets or the moods of the heavens, but by the One who created them. This provides a profound sense of spiritual autonomy. If the stars are merely signs and clocks set in place by a benevolent creator, then we are no longer victims of fate. We are residents in a house where the lights have been turned on for our benefit. There is also a deep lesson here about the nature of governance. The sun and moon are given authority to rule the day and the night, but their rule is entirely beneficial and life-giving. They do not rule for their own sake, but to serve the earth and its inhabitants. This reflects the character of God's own sovereignty. True spiritual authority, according to the pattern of Genesis, is not about domination, but about providing the light and the order that others need to flourish. It suggests that whenever God grants power or rule in our own lives, it is always a delegated responsibility intended to bless the territory we have been given to manage. The introduction of the Moed, or sacred times, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, reveals that God is interested in the rhythm of our lives. He did not create a world of endless, undifferentiated labor. He created a world with built-in reminders of his presence. The stars and the moon were designed to tell us when it is time to feast, when it is time to rest, and when it is time to worship. Spiritually, this means that time itself is holy. It is not just a resource to be spent or a commodity to be saved. It is a gift to be observed. By looking at the sky, the believer is reminded that they are part of a larger cosmic choreography directed by God. Finally, the understated creation of the stars serves to humble our perspective of human problems. If the billions of galaxies in the universe were an afterthought for God, as Genesis chapter 1 verse 16 implies, then no situation in our lives is too complex for his wisdom to handle. The light that God provides is always sufficient to separate the day from the darkness in our own hearts. The fourth day teaches us that we can look up at the night sky and see not a cold, indifferent void, but a ceiling full of lamps placed there by a father who wanted to make sure his children could find their way home. With the fifth day of the creation narrative, we witness a profound shift in the story's energy. For the first 4 days, the focus was on forming, establishing the light, the sky, the land, and the celestial clocks. The world was a beautifully structured house, but it was a quiet one. Now the narrative moves into the phase of filling. The stillness of the primordial waters and the vast emptiness of the vault of the sky are suddenly broken by the introduction of movement colour and voice. This is the moment where the living soul makes its first appearance on the stage of history. Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 through 23. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. Historical context. To understand the weight of Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 through 23, we have to recognize that for the ancient mind, the sea and the sky were not just biological habitats. They were the most mysterious and frightening realms of the universe. In the ancient Near East, the ocean was the abyss, a place of untamed chaos. For the Israelites, who were generally a land-based people, the deep sea was a graveyard and a source of terror. The Mesopotamian and Canaanite cultures believed these realms were inhabited by powerful semi-divine monsters that even the gods had to struggle to control. The most significant historical detail in this passage is found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, where the text mentions the great creatures of the sea. The Hebrew word used here is Tannanim. In the surrounding cultures, the Tannanim were not just big fish. In Canaanite mythology, the Tannin, or Lotan, was a multi-headed chaos dragon, a rival to the gods who personified the destructive power of the sea. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the goddess Tiamat creates a brood of giant serpents and monster snakes to fight her war against the younger gods. When an ancient person looked at the ocean, they didn't see a resource. They saw a battlefield populated by monsters that were nearly as powerful as the deities themselves. Genesis performs another spectacular act of demythologization here by stating that God created Bara, the Tannanim. Moses is stripping these monsters of their divine and terrifying status. To the Israelites, this was a massive nothing to see here statement. Moses is saying that those dragons, the Babylonians and Canaanites are so afraid of are just large animals that God made on a Thursday afternoon. They are not God's rivals. They are his pets. They are part of the good creation. Oh, and they follow his rules just like everything else. This removed the element of cosmic dread from the natural world. It taught the Israelites that there is no corner of the universe, not even the deepest part of the ocean, where chaos is in charge. The creation of the birds in Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, also carried deep historical resonance. In Egypt, where the Israelites had lived for 4 centuries, birds were often worshipped as gods or as messengers of the gods. The falcon was the symbol of Horus, the protector of the pharaoh, and the ibis was the symbol of Thoth, the god of wisdom. The sky was the domain of deities. By placing birds in the same category as the swarming creatures of the sea, Genesis is reducing these god symbols to the level of common biological life. They are winged birds according to their kind, not manifestations of the divine. This effectively cleared the sky of Egyptian idols and replaced them with a diverse, singing testimony to the creativity of the God of Israel. Finally, we encounter the first instance of a blessing in Genesis chapter 1, verse 22. In the ancient Near East, fertility was the primary goal of all religion. People performed complex and often ritualistically sexualized acts to persuade the gods of the rain and the soil to grant them offspring and crops. The gods were seen as stingy with life, and fecundity had to be bargained for. Genesis flips this entire system on its head. God does not need to be persuaded to grant life. He commands life to be fruitful and increase. The power to reproduce is presented as a gift that God built into the creatures themselves. This was a message of immense liberation for the Israelites. It meant that the abundance of the world was not something they had to bribe out of the gods. It was a fundamental blessing already spoken over the earth by their Creator. The fifth day transformed the terrifying abyss and the idol-filled sky into a teeming, blessed, and well-ordered home. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, the command begins with the phrase, "Let the water teem with living creatures." The Hebrew text uses a beautiful linguistic repetition here, Yishretzu Hamayim Sheret. A literal translation would be, "Let the waters swarm with swarmers." The word sheret refers to things that move in large groups, crawl, or swarm. It suggests a sudden, explosive abundance of life. For the first time in the narrative, we encounter the phrase living creatures, which in Hebrew is nefesh chaya. This is a pivotal term. The word nefesh is often translated as soul or living being, and it refers to the life breath or the animation that distinguishes animals from plants. While the plants on the third day were living in a biological sense, they were not nefesh. The fifth day introduces creatures with consciousness, movement, and the breath of life. The creation of the great creatures of the sea in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, is one of the most significant literal details in the chapter. The author uses the verb bara, which is the same word for create, used in the very first verse of the book. This is only the second time bara appears in Genesis, signaling that God is doing something entirely new. He is not just forming existing material, he is initiating a new level of existence, sentient, self-moving life. The great creatures are the Tananim Gedolim. In a literal biological sense, this refers to whales, giant squid, and large sea reptiles. The text emphasizes that they were created according to their kinds, or leminahem. Just as with the plants, the animals are given genetic boundaries. They are not the result of a chaotic mixing of species. They are distinct, orderly, and designed to reproduce within their own categories. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 22, the text records the first time God speaks directly to his creation. He blessed them using the Hebrew word barak. To bless someone in the ancient world was to confer upon them the power and the potential to succeed in their purpose. The content of this blessing is the command to be fruitful and increase in number. In Hebrew, this is peru urebu. These are the first two imperatives given to any living thing. Peru refers to the bearing of fruit, and rebu refers to the multiplication of that life. Finally, the instruction to fill the waters and the earth, milu, indicates that God's design for life is one of saturation. He does not want a sparse world. He wants a world that is brimming with the vitality he has just spoken into existence. The fifth day concludes in Genesis chapter 1, verse 23, with the familiar rhythm of evening and morning. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual significance of the fifth day is found in the transition from structure to animation. We see that God is not only interested in the architecture of the universe, but also in its inhabitants. The introduction of the nefesh, the living soul, reveals that God values consciousness and individual life. It teaches us that the world is more than a machine or a cold set of laws. It is a place designed for relationship and movement. Spiritually, this suggests that God's work in our own lives follows a similar pattern. He first establishes the structure of our character and our circumstances, and then he breathes his life into those structures. The fifth day is a celebration of the vitality of God, showing us that he is a God of movement, song, and exuberant diversity. The demythologization of the Tannanim in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21, carries a deep spiritual lesson about fear. By identifying the most terrifying creatures of the deep as part of God's good creation, the text invites the reader to a state of cosmic peace. It tells us that there is nothing in the depths of our world or our subconscious that is beyond the authority of the Creator. The things that the world considers monsters are to God simply another part of the diversity he designed. This calls the believer to a posture of courage. If the great dragons are merely created things that follow God's command, then we do not need to live in fear of the unknown or the chaotic. We can trust that the Spirit hovering over the waters is still the master of the deep. The first blessing in Genesis chapter 1, verse 22, reveals the heart of God toward all of life. We see that God is a multiplier. His very first words to the living creatures are words of empowerment. This suggests that the natural state of God's creation is one of growth and abundance. The blessing of fertility is not something we have to earn. It is a gift that is spoken over us before we even begin to work. It reframes our understanding of productivity. True fruitfulness is not about frantic effort, but about participating in the blessing that God has already placed within our nature. It is the spiritual assurance that God wants his children and his creation to thrive, to fill their territories, and to experience the fullness of the life he has given them. Finally, the fifth day highlights the beauty of diversity as a spiritual value. The text delights in the teeming waters and the winged birds of every kind. It suggests that the glory of God is not found in uniformity, but in the spectacular variety of his works. Just as the ocean and the sky are filled with thousands of different voices and forms, the spiritual life is one of infinite variety. Every kind has its place and its purpose. This encourages the individual to embrace their own unique kind and their own specific place in the vault of God's kingdom. We are reminded that the God who enjoys the song of the bird and the movement of the whale is the same God who finds joy in the unique expression of our own lives. The fifth day transforms our view of the world from a static painting into a living, breathing symphony of praise. We have arrived at the first half of the sixth day of creation. Following the exuberant filling of the oceans and the skies on the fifth day, the narrative returns its focus to the dry ground that emerged on the third day. This passage represents the final stage of preparation before the arrival of humanity. It is here that the land, which has already produced the silent life of plants and trees, is now commanded to bring forth creatures of breath, movement, and complex instinct. As we look at these verses, we see the culmination of the world's biological structure, set firmly against the animal-worshipping cultures of the ancient Near East. Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 and 25. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kind, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Historical context. To understand the historical shock of Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 and 25, we must look at the way the ancient world viewed the animal kingdom. For the Israelites who had spent 4 centuries in Egypt, animals were far more than just biological organisms. They were the primary lenses through which the divine was understood. Egyptian religion was famously zoomorphic. The god Anubis was depicted with the head of a jackal, Horus with the head of a falcon, Sobek with the head of a crocodile, and the goddess Bastet as a cat. In Egypt, the boundary between the animal and the divine was intentionally blurred. Certain animals were considered literal incarnations of gods and were treated with the highest degree of religious ritual and protection. In this context, Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, performs an act of radical cultural subversion by stating that the land produced these creatures at the command of the one true God. Moses is strip mining the animal kingdom of its divinity. He is telling the Israelites that the jackal, the crocodile, and the bull are not gods to be feared or appeased. They are living creatures created by Elohim. They are part of the material world, not the spiritual one. To a people who had seen the Pharaoh worship a sacred bull, in the declaration that God simply commanded the livestock into existence was a massive shift in world perspective. It transformed the animal world from a pantheon of deities into a resource for human stewardship. This passage also addresses the ancient Near Eastern tension between the civilized world and the wilderness. In Mesopotamian culture, particularly in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is a deep fear of the wild. Enkidu, a central character, begins as a wild man living among the animals and must be civilized to enter human society. The wild animals of the steppe were seen as agents of chaos and death, existing in a realm that was hostile to the gods of the city. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the beasts of the field are often depicted as the terrifying offspring of the chaos mother Tiamat, created specifically for war, when Genesis counters this by placing the wild animals in the same category of goodness as the livestock. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 25, God makes the wild animals according to their kinds and sees that they are good. This was a revolutionary historical claim. The wilderness is not a place of demonic chaos. Even the predators and the untamed beasts are part of God's ordered functional design. There is no evil part of the natural world that God did not intend. For a people wandering through a literal wilderness, where lions and jackals were a very real threat, this provided a profound sense of psychological security. It meant that even in the most dangerous parts of the earth, they were still within the boundaries of their God's good creation. The specific categorization of animals into livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals reflects a highly sophisticated, ancient Near Eastern worldview. This classification was not based on modern biology, but on the relationship these animals had with human civilization. The livestock were the animals of the farm and the household. The creating things were the insects and small reptiles of the immediate environment, and the wild animals were the beasts of the untracked land. By grouping them all under the command of God, Genesis is asserting that God is the Lord of both the farm and the forest. He is the God of the hearth and the God of the hunt. Finally, the phrase, according to their kinds, which we have seen repeatedly throughout the chapter, reaches its peak here. In the myths of the ancient Near East, the world was often populated by chimera, monsters that were half animal and half human, or combinations of different species. These hybrid creatures represented the instability and unpredictability of the spirit world. Genesis rejects this entirely by emphasizing that every animal was made according to its kind. Moses is presenting a world of absolute biological integrity. There are no god monsters lurking in the shadows. The world is predictable, orderly, and reliable. For a people entering a new land with its own set of terrifying myths, this was a document of intellectual and spiritual liberation. The animals were just animals, and the God who made them was the same God who led his people out of Egypt. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 24, the command is unique because God addresses the earth itself. Let the land produce living creatures. The Hebrew for living creatures is Nefesh Chaya, the same term used for the sea and sky life on the fifth day. However, here we see a specific three-part categorization of land-based life. The first is livestock, the Hebrew word behemah. This term typically refers to large, four-footed animals that are capable of being domesticated, such as cattle, sheep, or beasts of burden. Literally, God is preparing the specific animals that will eventually live in close proximity to human civilization. The second category is the creatures that move along the ground, which is the Hebrew word rimnes. This is often translated as creeping things and encompasses a vast array of life: reptiles, amphibians, insects, and small mammals. The term literally suggests a scurrying or gliding motion. The third category is wild animals, or Chayat Haaretz, which literally means beasts of the earth. This refers to the untamed predatory or large animals that exist outside the boundaries of human agriculture. By grouping these three categories together, the text provides a literal survey of all terrestrial life forms, from the smallest beetle to the largest lion. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 25, we see the shift from the command to the action. God made the wild animals. The verb used here is asa, which we have seen used for the fashioning or appointing of elements into their functional roles. It is important to notice the literal repetition of the phrase according to their kinds. This occurs 3 times in this verse alone, once for each category of animal. And this linguistic emphasis reinforces the principle of biological boundaries and order. In the original Hebrew, the word for kind, min, acts as a legal and biological limit. It ensures that the diversity of the land is not a chaotic sprawl, but a structured collection of distinct identities. The section concludes with the divine evaluation. God saw that it was good. This signifies that the biological preparation of the planet is now complete. The house is built, the lights are on, the gardens are growing, and the inhabitants have arrived. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual significance of the 6th day's first half lies in the collaborative nature of creation. When God says, "Let the land produce," he is inviting the earth to be a co-participant in the bringing forth of life. This suggests a spiritual principle of delegated creativity. Like God often chooses to work through the soil of our lives, our natural talents, our histories, and our physical existence, to produce something that is living and soul-filled. It teaches us that our physical nature is not an obstacle to God's work, but is actually the medium through which he chooses to manifest his creative will. The land is not just a platform, it is a productive partner under the word of God. The inclusion of the wild animals in God's good evaluation provides a profound lesson in the sanctity of the untamed. In our spiritual lives, we often want to domesticate everything. We want our circumstances, and even our faith, to be as predictable as livestock. However, by creating and blessing the Chayat Haaretz, God is declaring that there is value and goodness in the things we cannot control or utilize. The wilderness has its own kind of goodness that does not depend on its usefulness to humans. This humbles our perspective and reminds us that the world was created for the pleasure of God before it was given to the care of man. It invites us to trust God even with the wild and unpredictable areas of our journey, knowing that they too are part of His ordered design. There is also a message of stability in the repeated phrase, according to their kinds. In a world that often feels spiritually and emotionally volatile, the sixth day reminds us that God is the author of consistency. The reliability of the natural world, the fact that animals produce after their own kind, is a physical reflection of the faithfulness of God's character. We can rest in the knowledge that God is not a God of confusion. Just as He established boundaries for the beasts of the field, He establishes boundaries for our lives. This provides a sense of spiritual security, allowing us to find our place within the kind of life God has called us to live, without the pressure of having to be everything at once. Finally, the completion of the animal kingdom on the sixth day reveals the depth of God's preparation for humanity. Before the first human is created in the following verses, God ensures that every level of biological support and companionship is already in place. The livestock are ready for the farm, and the wild animals are ready for the forest. This speaks to the providential care of the Creator. He does not bring His children into an empty or unfinished world. He populates the earth with beauty, movement, and life, and ensuring that when the image of God finally arrives, they enter a world that is not only functional, but vibrant and overflowing with the vitality of the Nephesh. The morning of the sixth day is the final Amen to the world of nature before the introduction of the world of man. We have now reached the apex of the creation narrative. After 5 days of forming the heavens and the earth, and half a day of populating the land with animals, the focus of the entire cosmos narrows down to a single, extraordinary moment. Everything that has come before, the light, the atmosphere, the dry ground, and the teeming life of the seas and skies, has been a preparation for this specific event. In these 3 verses, we see the introduction of humanity, not as another animal among many, but as the unique image bearer of the Creator. This passage is the most radical declaration of human dignity ever written, and it was designed to fundamentally reshape how the Israelites viewed themselves after centuries of slavery. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Historical context. To understand the historical shock of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, we must look at the way the surrounding civilizations viewed the origin and purpose of human beings. In the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. Humans were created as an afterthought and for a humiliating purpose. According to the Babylonian story, the younger gods were tired of the hard labor required to maintain the universe, digging canals and providing food for the senior deities. To solve this problem, the god Marduk killed a rebellious deity named Kingu and used his blood to fashion humans. The explicit purpose of humanity in the Babylonian worldview was to be a slave class for the gods, to relieving the divine beings of their toil. Against this backdrop, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 makes a revolutionary counterclaim. Humans are not created from the blood of a dead, rebellious God to be slaves. They are created by the deliberate, peaceful decree of the one true God to be his representatives. In the ancient world, the concept of being made in the image of a god was a very specific political term. In both Egypt and Babylon, the only person who was said to be the image of the god was the king, or the pharaoh. The monarch was the living statue of the deity on earth, and only he possessed the image that gave him the right to rule. By stating in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, that God created mankind in his own image, Moses was performing a radical act of theological democratization. He was telling a nation of former slaves, people who had been treated as subhuman tools for the pharaoh's building projects, that every single one of them was a king. Every human being, regardless of their social status, was a bearer of the divine image. This was a direct, polemical attack on the imperial structures of Egypt and Babylon. It asserted that human dignity is not granted by a government or a king, but is an inherent quality granted by the Creator at the moment of origin. The phrase, "let us," in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, has also been a subject of intense historical and theological discussion. In the context of the ancient Near East, high-ranking kings did not act alone, as they acted in consultation with their divine council of advisors and attendants. By using the plural us, the text portrays God as a king presiding over his heavenly court, making a grand, formal announcement of his most important project. While later Christian theology would see hints of the Trinity here, for the original Israelite audience, this was a way of emphasizing the majesty and the gravity of the decision to create humanity. It was the ultimate, royal decree of the universe. Furthermore, the inclusion of male and female in the divine image in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, was a significant departure from surrounding myths. In many ancient Near Eastern traditions, the creation of woman was a secondary event, often involving goddesses or lower spirits. In Genesis, however, both male and female are placed under the singular umbrella of the image of God. This established a foundation for the equality of the sexes that was virtually unheard of in the 15th century BC. It signaled that the image is not found in a specific gender, but in the shared humanity of both. Finally, the command to subdue and rule in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, redefined the relationship between humans and the natural world. In the pagan world, nature was something to be feared or worshipped because it was controlled by capricious gods. You had to appease the god of the rain or the spirit of the forest. Genesis tells the Israelites that they are not the victims of nature, but its stewards. They were given the royal mandate to manage the earth on God's behalf. To a people entering a wild, untamed land, this was a call to vocational responsibility. They were not just surviving, they were governing. They were the vice-regents of the King of Kings, appointed to bring order and beauty to the earth, just as God had done during the first 6 days of creation. Literal breakdown. The linguistic transition in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 is marked by a shift in the divine "let there be" formula. For the first time, God does not command an element of nature to produce. Instead, he consults within his own being, saying, "Let us make mankind." The Hebrew word for mankind is Adam, which serves as a generic term for humanity as a whole, before it becomes a personal name later in the text. The phrase, "in our image," uses the word tselem, while "in our likeness" uses demut. In the ancient world, Or Tselem was often a physical statue or a representative image set up by a king in a distant territory to show his authority was present there. By using both words, the text emphasizes that humans are not just sort of like God. They are a precise, functional representation of his character and authority on the earth. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, the narrative shifts into a poetic structure, signaling the profound importance of this moment. It says, "God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." And this is the first mention of gender in the Bible. The Hebrew words sakar and nekeba are biological terms for male and female, emphasizing that the image of God is carried by the totality of humanity in its diverse forms. The image is not a physical shape, but a status and a capacity for relationship and creativity that is shared equally by both sexes. The command in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, introduces two powerful verbs, subdue and rule. The word for subdue is kabash, which literally means to bring something into order or to tread down. It implies that the earth, though good, still requires human effort to organize and develop. The word for rule is radat, which is a royal term used for a king governing his people. This is not a license for exploitation or destruction. In the context of the Hebrew Bible, a king's rule was successful only if it resulted in the flourishing and peace of the subjects. Literally, God is commissioning humanity to be the managers and caretakers of the planetary systems he has just established. The blessing of being fruitful and increasing is the same Peru Urebu given to the animals on the fifth day, but it is now linked to the royal vocation of planetary governance. Spiritual meaning, the spiritual weight of being made in the image of God, provides the ultimate foundation for human worth and ethics. It teaches us that our value is not something we earn through our productivity, our intelligence, or our social status. It is a given reality, written into our very nature by the Creator. This suggests that every human interaction is, in a sense, a spiritual encounter. If every person carries the tselem of God, then how we treat others is a direct reflection of how we view the one who made them. It removes the possibility of viewing any person as disposable or less than, providing a radical or permanent ground for justice and compassion. The royal mandate to rule and subdue the earth in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, reveals that work and creativity are essential parts of the spiritual life. Humanity was not created to be passive observers of the world, but to be active participants in its development. This suggests that when we build, organize, create art, or care for the environment, we are fulfilling our original image-bearing purpose. Our vocation is to mirror God's own work during the first 6 days, bringing order out of chaos and life out of emptiness. It transforms the concept of labor from a burden into a sacred calling, showing us that God's intent is for us to share in the joy of making the world a place where beauty and order can thrive. Furthermore, the relational nature of the us in Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 and the male and female in Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 highlights that the image of God is inherently social. God is not a solitary, isolated entity. He is a being who exists in community and consultation. Therefore, we most clearly reflect the image of God when we live in healthy, creative relationships with others. The diversity of gender and the command to increase suggest that the image is meant to be expressed through a vast global family. It teaches us that we cannot fully understand what it means to be human in isolation. We need the community of others to complete the picture of the God who made us. Finally, the blessing in Genesis chapter 1 verse 28 reminds us that the primary posture of God toward humanity is one of favor and empowerment. Before God gives a single law or makes a single demand, he gives a blessing. This establishes that our relationship with the Creator begins with his generosity, not our performance. The spiritual life is not an attempt to get God to bless us, but a response to the blessing he has already spoken over our existence. By calling us to fill the earth and subdue it, God is inviting us into a partnership of infinite potential. The sixth day concludes with the realization that the morning of human history has begun, not under the shadow of divine slavery, but in the light of divine representativeship. Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 through 31. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground. Everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Historical context. To understand the historical impact of Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 and 30, we must look at the contractual relationship between gods and humans in the ancient Near East. In the Babylonian and Mesopotamian traditions, the reason humans existed at all was to provide food for the gods. In the Atrahasis epic, the younger gods went on strike because the labor of maintaining the earth was too difficult. They were hungry and exhausted. Humans were created specifically to grow grain and offer sacrifices so that the gods could eat the steam and the fat of the offerings. In that worldview, the gods were the consumers and humans were the producers. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 performs a stunning historical reversal of this relationship. Instead of humans feeding a hungry God, we see God feeding his creatures. By saying, I give you every seed-bearing plant, the God of Israel identifies himself as the ultimate host and provider. He is the one who sets the table for humanity. For an audience of former slaves in the wilderness who had been forced to produce food for Pharaoh's tables while living on meager rations themselves. This was a revelation of a different kind of king. It taught them that their God was not a predator who took from his subjects, but a generous father who ensured their flourishing before he asked anything of them. The description of the original diet, both for humans and animals, as being purely vegetarian in Genesis chapter 1 verse 30, carries significant polemical weight. In many ancient Near Eastern myths, the world was born out of violence and conflict. Predation and the shedding of blood were seen as fundamental natural parts of the cosmic order. However, the author of Genesis presents an original state of existence where there is no violence, no killing, and no fear between species. This concept of the peaceable kingdom served as a critical counterclaim. It suggested that violence is not the original intent of the Creator, but is a distortion of the very good world. It presented a vision of total harmony, where the breath of life, Nefesh Chaya, was respected in every creature. Furthermore, the staples mentioned, seed-bearing plants and fruit-bearing trees, were the most valuable assets in the ancient world. In the economy of 1440 BC, land with fruit trees and grain was the definition of wealth. By giving every such plant to humanity, God was bestowing an inheritance of infinite value. He was giving them the keys to the pantry of the entire earth. This reinforced the royal status of humanity we saw in the previous verses. In the ancient Near East, only a king owned the land and its produce. By giving the produce to all of mankind, God was reiterating that every human being shares in the royal inheritance of the earth. Finally, we reach the grand summary in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. In the historical context of the ancient Near East, when a king completed a great project, a palace, a temple, or a city wall, he would perform a formal inspection. He would walk through the completed work and declare it to be perfect or excellent, which served as his royal stamp of approval. This was a claim of total success. By declaring the entire creation very good, Tob Meod, Moses is showing that there are no glitches in God's design. There were no rogue gods who messed up a corner of the world, and no chaotic elements that God couldn't quite tame. To the Israelites, who were surrounded by cultures that believed the world was a messy, dangerous place, full of competing spiritual forces, as this was a declaration of absolute confidence. It meant that the world was exactly as God intended it to be, a unified, harmonious, and functional whole. The evening and the morning of the sixth day brought the narrative of forming and filling to its absolute climax. The house was finished, the servants were appointed, the food was provided, and the master of the house was satisfied. Literal breakdown. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, the language shifts to a formal presentation of a gift. God says, "I give you," which in the Hebrew is Hine Natati Lachem. This is a perfect tense verb, suggesting that the gift is already accomplished and settled. The phrase seed-bearing plant is Eseb Zoria Zera, and fruit with seed in it is Peri Es Zoria Zera. The literal repetition of the word seed throughout this verse is crucial. In the Hebrew mindset, the seed represented the potential for the future. By giving humanity the seeds, God was not just providing a single meal. He was providing a self-sustaining system of life. He was giving them the means of their own survival and the ability to partner with the land to produce more. This is a literal transfer of the technology of life from the Creator to the creature. Moving to Genesis chapter 1, verse 30, we see the extension of this provision to the animal kingdom. The text specifies that every beast, bird, and creeping thing with the breath of life, Nefesh Chaya, is given every green plant for food. The Hebrew term for green plant is Yerek Eseb, literally, but this indicates that the original biological design was one of total non-competition. There was no food chain in the modern sense because there was no death required for sustenance. Every living soul was supported by the primary producers of the third day. The literal structure of these two verses places humans and animals on a similar level as dependents of God's bounty, even while humans maintain their unique royal status. Finally, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, we encounter the final summary of the creation week. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. The Hebrew phrase is tov meod. Throughout the chapter, God has seen individual things as good, tobi, but the addition of the intensive meod changes the meaning significantly. While tob means functional and fit for purpose, tov meod suggests a superlative state of excellence and harmony. It is the difference between a single beautiful note and a perfectly resolved symphony. Literally, this evaluation applies to the all, K-all, the entire integrated system. It confirms that the relationship between the light, the sky, the land, the stars, the plants, the animals, and the humans is in a state of absolute perfection. The chapter then closes with the rhythmic seal. And there was even, and there was morning, the sixth day. Spiritual meaning. The spiritual center of the end of the sixth day is the revelation of God as the ultimate host. By beginning the human story with a gift of food in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, the text establishes that our relationship with God is not based on what we can do for him, but on what he has done for us. This provides a profound sense of spiritual rest. Before the first human could even begin to rule or subdue the earth, they had to sit at the table God had already prepared. It teaches us that our vocation, our work in the world, is always secondary to our dependency on God's grace. We are guests in God's world before we are stewards of it. The vision of the peaceable kingdom in Genesis chapter 1, verse 30, serves as a spiritual compass for the rest of the biblical narrative. By showing a world where no blood is shed for food, the text reminds us that violence and predatory behavior are not part of God's original, very good intent. This sets a standard for spiritual ethics. If the original world was one of harmony and mutual flourishing, then our spiritual growth should move us back toward that state of peace, as it challenges the idea that survival of the fittest is the highest law of existence. Instead, it points to a higher law of universal provision, where every living soul has a place and a portion provided by the Creator. The evaluation of very good in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, is a powerful affirmation of the material world. In many spiritual traditions throughout history, the physical has been viewed as evil, dirty, or a prison for the spirit. Genesis 1 flatly rejects this dualism. When God looks at the physical earth, the dirt, the plants, the bodies of animals, and the physical forms of men and women, he calls it very good. Spiritually, this means that our bodies and our environment are not obstacles to our relationship with God. They are the very things he delighted to make. It invites the believer to see the holiness in the all, to recognize that every part of the created order carries the stamp of divine approval. Furthermore, the very good status of the whole creation reminds us of the interconnectedness of all life. The world is not just a collection of separate kinds. It is a single, unified masterpiece. This suggests a spiritual principle of wholeness. When we look at our own lives or the world around us, we often see fragments and chaos. But the sixth day encourages us to trust that God sees the all. He is working toward a totality that is harmonious and complete. Even the evening of the first 6 days was always moving toward the morning of a finished work. Finally, the completion of the sixth day marks the end of the work of forming and filling. The world is now a functioning home, fully equipped and beautifully inhabited. This provides a sense of cosmic security. We do not live in a world that is still being figured out, or a universe that is fundamentally broken at its core. We live in a world that was established as very good by the word of a sovereign king. The spiritual journey, then, is not about trying to fix a failed creation, but about learning to live in alignment with the original goodness and order that God established at the very beginning. The sixth day closes the door on the work of creation and prepares us for the unique and mysterious silence of the seventh day.